I confronted him to his face in front of everybody, like you guys should have seen it.
Is Paul a messy queen? A sharp examination of narrative, authority, and biblical ethics. People get uncomfortable the moment you ask questions about Paul. Not questions rooted in mockery, not questions rooted in rebellion, questions rooted in text, questions rooted in ethics, questions rooted in pattern recognition. Because the moment you begin reading Paul carefully, not devotionally, not traditionally, not through inherited church assumptions, something begins to stand out. His tone is different. His posture is different. His relationship to authority is different. And perhaps most importantly, the way he talks about other people is different. That difference matters. Because if we are told to test all things, then Paul should not be exempt from examination simply because his writings became foundational to later theology. The question is not whether Paul was intelligent. He clearly was. The question is not whether Paul believed what he was saying. He likely did. The question is not even whether Paul said true things. He often echoed truths that already existed in Torah, wisdom literature, and the teachings of Yeshua. The real question is this: what kind of social and spiritual behavior does Paul model? And when we compare that behavior to biblical ethics, not modern excuses, not church tradition, not personality worship, what does it actually resemble? That is where the phrase enters. Messy queen. A modern phrase, yes, but human behavior is ancient. A messy queen is not simply someone dramatic. A messy queen is someone who inserts themselves into social conflict, narrates other people's behavior, assigns motives, shapes reputation, tells stories that position themselves as morally superior, and often centers interpersonal tension as part of their identity. The term is humorous, but the pattern is serious. And the reason it applies here is because when you remove religious immunity from Paul and simply examine the structure of what he does, the similarities become difficult to ignore. Take the famous confrontation with Peter. Paul writes in Galatians, "When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned." Galatians 2:11. Immediately the framing begins. Paul is narrator. Paul is interpreter. Paul is witness. Paul is judge. Paul is the one recounting the story. Peter's voice is absent. And what follows is not simply a description of behavior. Paul goes further. He tells readers why Peter acted. He began to draw back and separate himself because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. Galatians 2:12. That line matters, because Paul is not merely saying what Peter did, he is claiming to know why Peter did it. That is motive attribution. And motive attribution carries power, especially when the person being discussed is not present to respond. This is where people often try to escape the tension by saying, "Well, Paul was probably right." But that is not the question. The question is, how does he know? Did Peter say he was afraid? The text does not say so. Did Paul ask him privately and confirm motive? The text does not say so. Did Peter later write a response confirming Paul's account? No surviving text exists. All we have is Paul. One narrator, one interpretation, one framing. And this matters because biblical ethics repeatedly warn about speech, not merely lying. Speech, the way we talk about people, the way we frame people, the way we present motives, the way we shape perception. Torah says, "Do not go about spreading slander among your people." Leviticus 19:16. Proverbs warns, "A gossip betrays a confidence." Proverbs 11:13. And Yeshua gives a correction process. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Matthew 18:15. Then witnesses. Then broader escalation. There is order. There is sequence. There is restraint. So what do we see in Galatians? We see Paul say, I said to Cephas before them all. Galatians 2:14. Public confrontation. Public retelling. Public framing. No recorded private process. No preserved reconciliation. No Peter perspective. No humility statements such as, perhaps I misunderstood him. No caution. No uncertainty. Just certainty. Uncertainty about another person's internal state. That is where the discomfort begins, because people often imagine biblical figures as emotionally sanitized. But human behavior has always looked similar. We recognize patterns. Someone tells a story where they appear courageous, another person appears weak, and the audience is positioned to admire the storyteller. That pattern is not new. It is ancient. And this is where the phrase, messy queen, becomes less about insult and more about behavioral archetype. Because messy behavior is not defined by volume. It is defined by social function. What does the speech do? Who benefits? Who loses? What perception is created? And perhaps most importantly, what spiritual fruit emerges? That question matters, because if a story does not restore, reconcile, instruct in righteousness, or illuminate divine wisdom, then what purpose is it serving? What does Galatians 2 teach spiritually? Does it teach forgiveness? No. Does it teach reconciliation? No. Does it teach correction process? No. Does it model Matthew 18? No visible evidence suggests it does. What it does show is conflict, narrated by one side, framed through one perspective, delivered in a letter where Paul is defending his authority. That matters, because context matters. Paul is not telling a neutral story. He is arguing. He is persuading. He is establishing legitimacy. And legitimacy often requires contrast. If Paul is strong, someone else must appear inconsistent. If Paul is discerning, someone else must appear compromised. If Paul is fearless, someone else must appear afraid. That does not prove malicious intent, but it does reveal rhetorical function. And rhetoric matters, especially in sacred texts, because words shape memory, words shape authority, words shape theology, words shape how communities remember people. And Peter, in this passage, is remembered through Paul's description, not through his own. That is a significant imbalance. People often say, Paul was just standing for truth. Maybe, but truth is not merely what you say. Truth is also how you say it. Truth is also whether you preserve dignity. Truth is also whether correction follows righteous order. Truth is also whether speech builds or tears down. Paul's certainty is what makes the passage feel unusual, because he does not present possibility. He presents interpretation as settled fact. Peter was afraid. Peter was wrong. Paul was right. That is how the narrative functions. And when people ask why some readers experience friction with Paul, this is part of the reason. Not because questioning Paul is rebellious, but because his rhetoric often feels less like parable and more like positioning, less like humble witness and more like authority assertion. less like relational correction and more like narrative control. And this becomes even more noticeable when compared with Yeshua. Yeshua corrected. Yeshua rebuked. Yeshua confronted. But Yeshua also taught through story. Yeshua often protected identity through parable. Yeshua did not spend extended passages narrating interpersonal conflicts where he positioned himself as the triumphant corrector of absent people. The energy feels different. The orientation feels different. And that difference deserves examination. Not because Paul must automatically be rejected, but because sacred texts deserve scrutiny, and because reverence should never eliminate discernment. So, is Paul a messy queen? As a literal historical label, that is modern slang applied retroactively. But as a behavioral archetype? As a pattern of public narration, motive attribution, conflict framing, and authority positioning, the overlap is difficult to ignore. And perhaps the deeper question is not whether Paul fits a slang phrase. Perhaps the deeper question is, why are people so uncomfortable examining him honestly? Because if all scripture is to be tested, weighed, examined, and discerned, then no writer, no matter how influential, should sit beyond inquiry. Discernment does not stop where tradition begins, and questioning is not rebellion. Sometimes questioning is the beginning of clarity.
So then Peter got afraid. XOXO.
Is this biblical or what Christ taught?